Welcome to the first lecture for the reproductive system. The reproductive system will mainly be covered in Chapter 27, and then we're going to do some of the Chapter 28 content as well. Chapter 27 deals with the male and female reproductive parts and the, As I was saying, Chapter 27 deals with the male and female reproductive parts and the hormonal regulation of the development of sperm in males and the egg cells in females. And then Chapter 28 actually deals with development of an embryo and a fetus and childbirth and pregnancy. And this will be a fairly extensive half of a unit, so it's going to actually be quite a bit more extensive than the urinary system information that you had for the other part of Unit 5, so keep that in mind. It'll take you longer to work through this body system. Alright, so we're going to be talking about the reproductive system in males and females. Obviously there are major differences. A couple of terminology things here, and some of this you may have already heard if you've done the anatomy videos for the reproductive system already. The primary sex organs are not often what people think they are when they haven't studied the reproductive system before. Your primary sex organs, your primary reproductive organs, are also known as the gonads. Yes, that is actually a clinical term. And in males, those are the testes, and in females, those are the ovaries. And the reason why these are your primary sex organs is because in males the testes are the sites of sperm development, and in ovaries that's where the egg cells develop, also known as the oocytes is another term for egg cells that we'll be using. Okay, so sex cells are also called gametes. That's another term you should be familiar with, and again in males those are called sperm. A fully mature gamete in a female is called an ovum, which is singular, and ova is the plural form of that word. We're mainly going to be talking about oocytes, which are cells that are involved in the maturation processes that lead to these in a female. Also, your primary sex organs in males and females secrete the vast majority of the sex hormones, which are also called steroid sex hormones because they're part of the steroid class, if you remember that from the very beginning of the semester. Steroid sex hormones are hydrophobic and they're derived from cholesterol molecules. They're modified cholesterol molecules. And if you look at male sex hormones versus female sex hormones, chemically they're very, very similar, just very slight differences between them. But those slight differences result in major differences in the male and the female body, and they lead to the male and female sex characteristics that we associate with the two genders. Male sex hormones as a group can be called androgens, and you've probably heard the term androgynous before. Androgens are male sex hormones. Testosterone is the key androgen that is produced in the testes. And then in females, the major steroid sex hormones are the estrogens and also progesterone. And so we'll be learning about what these different sex hormones do as we proceed through this unit. All right, so those are your primary reproductive organs, and then both males and females, of course, have accessory or secondary reproductive organs, and these include a series of ducts, which are internal passageways, glands that secrete substances, and also the external genitalia. All of those things are secondary sex hormones. All right, as I mentioned, the sex hormones play very important roles in males and females. They're important they start being produced at high levels when a boy or a girl reaches puberty, and they're very important for the development of the reproductive organs. So you've got to have these sex hormones for males to produce functional sperm and for females to produce functional ova. The sex hormones are also important for sexual behavior and sex drive. That drive to reproduce, sort of important if you want to continue as a species on the planet. And also the growth and development of many other organs and tissues. And as I mentioned earlier, these sex hormones are what stimulate various tissues throughout the body to take on the characteristics that we associate with an average male and an average female, which you can see some of those characteristics highlighted here on the slide. All right, for the rest of this particular video lecture, we're going to focus in on the male reproductive system, and some of this will be a rehash of information on the anatomy side, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back through the male reproductive anatomy in detail. You probably want to watch the reproductive anatomy videos before moving forward with the physiology so that you're familiar with all the different parts. All right, so as I mentioned, in males, the testes are the primary sex organs of males, and they're located within the scrotum. That's the skin-covered pouch that the testes are located in, and they're responsible for producing sperm cells, and we will be learning the details of how all that takes place. Once sperm have been generated in the testes, they have a pathway that they have to travel through, a series of tubes, which are also known as ducts. And those include, as they leave the testes, they first move into the epididymis. You have one of those located on the posterior side of each testis. Testis is the singular form of the word testes. And from there, the sperm move into the ductus deferens, also known as the vas deferens. It's probably the more common term for it. From the vas deferens, the sperm move into a very short area called the ejaculatory duct, and that's where they're located. That's the last place they pass through before they're going to enter the urethra during ejaculation, and that's when they're going to be expelled out of the external urethral orifice that we learned about during the urinary system. And that's going to be their exit point, of course, out of the penis in the male. All right, so that is the testes and then that system of ducts through which the sperm are going to pass. What about the accessory sex glands? So the testes are a gland, and in fact they're an endocrine gland because they produce testosterone, sex hormone. These accessory sex glands are exocrine glands because they secrete substances that are going to wind up on internal surfaces, and eventually they're going to have an exit route out of the body. So these include the seminal glands, or the seminal vesicles. It's another name for those. The prostate, you just have one of those. And then the bulbourethral glands, which produce a lubricating fluid that lubricates and helps control the pH along the inside lining of the urethra. So the secretions of those three glands combine together and enter into the ducts during ejaculation. So those fluids are actually going to combine together, and they're going to be part of the semen fluid that is ejaculated or released from a male. And the semen contains the substances from those three glands, and it also contains the sperm cells as well. All right, and again, we're going to be covering the anatomy in a lot more detail over on the anatomy side for the reproductive system, but this is a cross-section view through the showing the male reproductive organs. And so here's a testis. This thing here looks kind of like an egg. That's where your sperm cells are generated. And then they move through this structure right in here. That's the epididymis. And that is basically a wadded up series of tiny tubules which are about 20 feet long in an average male. And that's where the sperm cells, they continue to mature, and they're stored while they're passing through that long stretch of wadded up, folded up tiny tubes in there. When they leave the epididymis, they travel along the vas deferens, and the vas deferens obviously has to exit the scrotum and has to enter the abdominopelvic cavity, so it's going to pass through the muscular floor of the pelvis, and then it kind of has a weird route. It wraps around the top of the bladder, curves around here to the backside. Here's a seminal vesicle or seminal gland. Right there you have two of those on the posterior side of the bladder. And then from there you enter this little area right in there is called the ejaculatory duct. So that's where the sperm cells and the fluids of a seminal vesicle combine. And also that's where the semen is waiting for an ejaculation to occur in a male. When ejaculation occurs, the semen, which contains the fluids of the seminal vesicle and also the prostate, here's your prostate gland right in here. The prostate is releasing fluids into that mixture as well. And during ejaculation, the semen is going to travel down the urethra to the external urethral orifice, and that's where it's going to exit the body. Over here, here's a bulbourethral gland, and that produces the lubricating substances that are released into the urethra just prior to ejaculation. So that's releasing a lubricating fluid. Okay, a little bit more about the scrotum and what that is. So remember, the testes are located inside the scrotum. The scrotum is a sac or a pouch of skin, and then underneath that you have superficial fascia, dense connective tissues that are protecting and covering the testes. And they do hang outside the abdominopelvic cavity. I'm assuming everybody knows that. You have two testes. This is a key feature. You know, why are the testes hanging down in the scrotum? That helps keep the temperature within the testes lower than lower than normal core body temperature. Normal core body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius. So in the scrotum it's about 34 degrees Celsius. And that lower temperature is actually necessary for sperm production. So in Fahrenheit, that's going to be about 4 to 5 degrees cooler than your 98.6 Fahrenheit normal body temperature. And you may have heard before that sometimes men who wear briefs and they're having trouble with fertility, they're not producing functional sperm. One of the reasons for that could be that the briefs are keeping the testes too close to the warmer core of their bodies, and so they switch over to boxers, and that can sometimes help cool the testes down enough for them to start producing functional sperm. There are a couple of muscles that are involved with the scrotum as well. There's a muscle called the dartus muscle, which is actually embedded within the fascia, and it's smooth muscle, and it's capable of wrinkling, and it helps pull the scrotum closer to the body when that needs to happen, like during cold weather conditions, because you don't want the testes to get too cold. So if they are getting too cold, then the dartus muscle can contract and help pull the scrotum closer to the body. The cremaster muscle, these are bands of actual skeletal muscles that extend down into the scrotum, and they're able to help elevate the testes when needed. And here's a diagram from your textbook which is showing you some of these different features. Now notice right in red here, that's, hang on. In red here on the diagram, that is supposed to represent the cremaster muscle. And the dartus muscle is actually embedded in purple. Here you've got this layer of fascia that's located just deep to the skin, so it's going to be dense connective tissue, and then there is smooth muscle embedded in there as well, and that's able to help out with contracting and raising the scrotum as well when needed to help protect the testes. All right, so for lecture number 2, we're actually going to talk more about the structure of the testes and what's going on in there. They're actually pretty complex little organs, so that'll be the focus for lecture number 2.